In a quiet valley nestled between rolling hills and gentle streams, there stood a quaint village whose red-roofed cottages clustered around a small chapel. Cobblestone paths wound through tidy squares where neighbors greeted each other with warmth. It was here, in this old-world haven, that a humble laborer named Edward lived with his wife Maria and their only child, Richard. Edward was known throughout the village primarily for two enduring qualities that, over time, etched his presence into the memory of every villager. First, his extraordinary gift as a handyman, an almost magical ability to breathe life into broken things. Whether it was a rickety wooden fence, a clock that had long stopped ticking, a millstone that refused to grind, or the ever-problematic cartwheels of the town baker, Edward would always find a way. He had the hands of a craftsman and the patience of a saint, and his workshop, cluttered and aromatic with sawdust and oil, was often referred to as the healing hut by locals. Second, and perhaps more unforgettable, was his missing eye. It wasn't just that the eye was absent. It was the quiet, uncomplaining way Edward carried himself despite the constant attention it drew. The vacant socket, often shaded by the brim of his wide hat, was a subject of fascination and discomfort, especially among the children. Though Edward never told the full story, whispers floated around. Some said it was from war, others a tragic accident involving tools or fire. Children would stare wide-eyed, some too frightened to speak, others blurting out insensitive questions. Edward always answered with a kind smile or gentle silence, never once displaying irritation. The older folk remembered him from decades ago, when he still had both eyes and a young man's fire. They noted how his quiet demeanor had deepened since the loss, how his expressions became more subdued, his laughter more internal. But with one eye, Edward saw more than most, the worry in a mother's brow when her son fell ill, the hunger hidden behind polite smiles, the envy, the sorrow, the longing in those around him. And yet, he carried no judgment. In the winters, when the village huddled indoors and snow blanketed every roof, Edward's one-eyed silhouette moving through the flurries became an image of quiet endurance. He'd shovel paths not just for himself, but for the widows and the old. He never asked for payment. In spring, he'd fix broken tools for farmers who had no coins to spare, accepting a loaf of bread or a jar of honey instead. So, while many may have flinched at the initial sight of his disfigurement, few in the village could deny the deep reservoir of kindness that Edward embodied. The missing eye, once a source of discomfort for others, slowly became a symbol, not of weakness, but of wisdom, resilience, and sacrifice. What no one outside his home realized, however, was that the true story behind that missing eye was far more heart-wrenching and noble than any rumor dared guess. Edward was not an old man, but years of back-breaking labor under the blazing summer sun and the relentless winter winds had carved deep furrows into his weathered face. His hands, calloused and thick from years of toil, spoke silently of a life spent in honest work. Each crease around his eyes and mouth told a story, of laughter shared under candlelight, of sleepless nights repairing a neighbor's fence, of countless mornings spent walking miles to mend a leaking roof or tend to the animals in distant stables. He was the kind of man who did not need an alarm clock. His body, attuned to the rhythm of the land, stirred long before the first light broke over the horizon. He would dress quietly so as not to wake Maria or little Richard, take a quick sip of lukewarm tea, and step out into the misty morning with his bundle of tools slung over one shoulder. The village knew him as a jack of all trades. Today he might be digging irrigation channels for the barley fields. Tomorrow he might be helping the elderly widow Annalise stack firewood before the snow. Edward never turned down a task, no matter how mundane or exhausting. In the meadows he moved among the tall barley stalks like a shadow, steady and dependable. During harvest season at the manor's vineyard, his hands would be stained with the juice of grapes, and he would hum old folk songs while loading baskets onto carts. Children often ran beside him on the path, waving cheerfully, though some kept their distance, still uneasy about the missing eye. But Edward never took offense. He greeted them all the same, with a patient smile and a tip of his cap. He worked not for ambition or pride, but out of necessity. His family came first. Every coin he earned was carefully rationed, part for food, part for clothes, and the rest tucked away for something more precious than his own comfort, his son's future. Edward bore his burdens without complaint. His one good eye, still sharp and steady, missed little. He saw how the seasons changed not just the landscape but the people around him. He noticed how Richard grew more distant with each passing year, how Maria tried to bridge that invisible gap with warm meals and quiet conversations. And yet Edward kept going. There were evenings when he would return home with his shirt soaked in sweat and his back aching beyond belief. But the moment he stepped inside the cottage and heard Maria's voice or saw the flicker of the hearth, a peace would settle over him. It was in these moments, between exhaustion and renewal, that Edward found purpose. His world was small but sacred. And in that world, his labor was not just survival, it was love in its most tangible form. Maria, his wife, was gentle and spry, though her hands bore the signs of a life spent in tireless labor. Each morning, she would rise not long after Edward, tying her hair into a neat bun and slipping her feet into worn leather shoes before beginning the day's tasks. The aroma of freshly baked bread was a daily gift to the cottage, filling it with warmth even in the coldest seasons. Her loaves, crusty on the outside and soft within, were often shared with neighbors or traded for a dozen eggs or a handful of chestnuts. In the garden behind the cottage, Maria cultivated a small but thriving patch of land. Lettuce, radishes, carrots, and even a few medicinal herbs grew in tidy rows she tended with care. She sang to the plants, in soft lullabies passed down from her mother, believing that love made things grow. Birds often landed nearby when she gardened, as if drawn by her serenity. Her days were filled with rhythm and purpose, cleaning, cooking, washing, and teaching young Richard the values of kindness and diligence. She mended his torn shirts, listened to his dreams, and brushed his hair gently while humming old folk melodies. To Richard she was the heart of the home, the warmth in the hearth, the whisper in the quiet hours of the night when fears crept in. Though times were lean, and the pantry sometimes echoed with emptiness, Maria's unyielding spirit kept despair at bay. She never let hardship steal the joy of small moments. A shared joke at dinner, the scent of apples stewing on the stove, or the way the snow sparkled on a winter morning. Edward's industrious nature may have been the engine that kept the family moving forward, but Maria was its soul. Together, they formed a quiet, resilient partnership, each balancing the other in a world that rarely offered ease, but often offered love in small, sacred forms. Their home, a simple cottage with a thatched roof and climbing roses, offered a modest sanctuary from life's struggles. There, Under low wooden beams and near a roaring fireplace, they spent their evenings together. But behind these peaceful scenes, one sorrow quietly festered. Their son Richard slowly grew to resent Edward for his missing eye, an eye he never understood. Young Richard adored stories of knights and dragons, of kings and their castles perched high on rugged cliffs that seemed to pierce the heavens. He would spend hours in the small village schoolhouse, sitting cross-legged by the window, immersed in hand-copied manuscripts filled with tales of valor, loyalty, and redemption. Each yellowed page sparked vivid images in his mind: a brave knight charging on horseback, a damsel whispering secrets behind a rose-covered turret, or a fearsome dragon guarding a chest of golden truth. Sometimes, after school, Richard would lie in the grass behind his home, staring at the sky and imagining himself as one of those heroes. He envisioned a different life, one where he wore shining armor and bore a family crest, where his parents were noble and admired by all. The tales of faraway lands whispered promises of a world where he could be anyone he wanted to be, where nothing, especially not his father's appearance, could hold him back. But no matter how high his daydreams soared, they always came crashing back to reality when the village children began whispering and pointing. They'd look at Edward, his quiet, limping father with the hollow eye, and then glance at Richard with a smirk. Even when nothing was said aloud, Richard felt the sting of judgment. A few of his rowdier classmates found cruel joy in pressing the matter. "Does your father frighten you at night with that empty socket?" they'd tease. "I heard he lost his eye in a duel. Maybe you'll lose one too," another would jeer. The words themselves were petty, the giggles childlike, but to Richard they were daggers. Over time, these moments planted seeds of shame. Shame for his father's appearance. Shame for his family's modest life. Shame for not fitting in with the ideal image of a hero's son. What tortured Richard most was the contrast between his romantic imagination and his stark reality. In stories, a father would be a king, a warrior, a man of unquestionable dignity and strength. But Edward was simple, unassuming, and marked by a visible flaw, an eye he no longer possessed. This gap between fantasy and reality became a chasm in Richard's heart. The shame was silent at first. He didn't speak it aloud, didn't dare voice the thoughts that gnawed at his pride. But Maria noticed. She saw it in the way Richard stopped walking to school with Edward, in how he averted his gaze when his father entered the room, and how his eyes lingered too long on the faces of other boys' fathers, faces unmarked, symmetrical, untouched by tragedy. Richard loved his father in the quiet, natural way that young children often do. But the love began to twist, tangled by embarrassment he couldn't yet name or fight. The village, with its close-knit intimacy and sharp-eyed gossip, offered no escape. Every sideways glance, every hesitant handshake, seemed to reinforce the idea that Edward's eye, and by extension, Richard's lineage, was something to be hidden. And so, even as he chased dragons in his mind and penned imaginary legends in the margins of his schoolbooks, Richard could not shake the one real question that tugged at him with relentless cruelty. Why must my father be so different? The children at school sometimes teased Richard about Edward's missing eye. Even if they didn't speak directly, their giggles, exaggerated whispers, and wide-eyed glances would crawl beneath Richard's skin like an unwelcome draft through a cracked window. During lessons, he would catch them casting sidelong glances his way, their eyes flicking between the ink-stained pages and his face, waiting for a reaction. He would clench his jaw, pretend not to hear, but his ears burned nonetheless. A few of his rowdier classmates took it further, emboldened by the laughter of others. "Does your father scare you in the dark with that hole in his face?" one boy taunted during recess, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "I bet he lost it fighting some beast in the woods," said another with a sneer. "Or maybe your mother clawed it out." The group erupted in laughter, the cruel kind that echoes and sticks. Another time, a new boy asked innocently, "Why does your father wear his cap so low? Is he hiding something awful?" The question wasn't meant as a joke, but the room fell silent. Richard felt as though he had been thrust onto a stage in front of a jeering audience, his private pain exposed to the daylight. These remarks might have been childish attempts at humor, born of ignorance rather than malice, but to Richard, they were a recurring nightmare that haunted both his days and his dreams. Each jab was not just a passing sting, it lingered in his memory, echoing in his thoughts long after the laughter had faded. The taunts followed him like a shadow, warping his sense of identity, not only in relation to his peers but in how he saw his own blood. Each insult, each cruel joke, drove an invisible wedge between Richard and Edward. At home, Edward was a haven of quiet strength, gentle, patient, and endlessly giving, always ready with a warm smile or a helping hand. He was the kind of father who fixed broken toys before Richard even asked, who carved wooden animals for him out of spare scraps, who stayed up late into the night patching holes in Richard's boots. But at school, that same man became the embodiment of Richard's perceived misfortune. It wasn't just the eye. It was what the eye symbolized in the eyes of others. The empty socket became a mark of otherness, of imperfection, of something wrong in the world of childish simplicity where appearances defined value. Richard, desperate to belong, began to absorb the judgment of others until it became his own. He internalized their cruelty and turned it inward, letting it ferment into something heavier, something darker. In his young heart, love and embarrassment began to war. He still cared for his father, deeply, instinctively, but that love was now tangled in the shame he could not articulate. He hated himself for feeling ashamed, and he hated Edward for being the reason. And yet, at night, when Maria tucked him in and he heard Edward's heavy boots outside the door, something in him still longed to run out and hug him, to curl against his chest and be reminded of the safety he once felt so easily. But he never did. Instead, resentment, slow but steady, took root like ivy creeping up a stone wall, quiet, persistent, and almost beautiful in how natural it seemed. And like ivy, it was beginning to cover the truth beneath it, choking out the foundation of love that had once grown there without question. He began to see Edward's physical difference as a reason for his own social difficulties. He felt singled out, pitted, or even ostracized by peers. And so, over time, a simmering resentment took shape in Richard's heart. He never dared voice it openly at first, but Maria could sense her son's growing discomfort. One crisp autumn afternoon, a group of village children gathered in a communal yard to play hoop and stick, a beloved pastime where players roll a wooden hoop with a small stick, trying to keep it balanced and in motion. Richard joined them eagerly, his laughter as bright as the setting sun. However, just as the children were having fun, the rhythm of laughter and rolling hoops was interrupted by the soft crunch of boots on gravel. Edward, bent slightly under the weight of a bundle of well-worn tools slung over his shoulder, passed by on his way to the blacksmith's shop, a regular stop in his daily circuit of work around the village. He paused for a brief moment, the corners of his mouth curling into his usual warm, if somewhat shy, smile. There was nothing forced about it. Edward's smile had a kind of other gentleness, the kind that came from years of kindness, quiet endurance, and living more for others than for himself. But that smile, however genuine, was not what caught the children's attention. It was the hollow where his left eye should have been, barely hidden beneath the brim of his cap. As the sunlight filtered through the golden leaves above, casting shifting shadows over the scene, his missing eye seemed to deepen like a well of mystery, or a wound long unhealed. The moment they noticed, the cheerful mood rippled into silence. A few children instinctively stepped back. Others paused mid-laugh, their expressions shifting from carefree to cautious. The wooden hoop rolled to a slow stop on the grass, forgotten. No one said anything, not yet, but the air had changed. A boy clutching his stick lowered it slowly, his eyes fixed on Edward's face. Another, chewing the edge of his sleeve, tilted his head and whispered something to his friend, who responded with a wide-eyed nod. Edward's smile faltered, only slightly, before he nodded courteously and resumed walking, his boots tapping the cobblestone path as though nothing had happened. He had grown used to these moments. Even after so many years, they never truly stopped stinging. "Is that your father?" one boy finally asked Richard in a hushed voice. Yes," Richard muttered, cheeks aflame. Sensing that Edward's presence unsettled the group, Richard felt a swell of frustration. Upon reaching home that evening, he lashed out. "Father, do you always have to walk past us when we're playing? You scare my friends away." Edward, hurt and confused, tried to explain he merely had errands to run. But Richard did not want to hear. His own embarrassment trumped all else. Despite the growing distance between them, Edward's devotion to Richard remained steady, unshaken by the boy's changing moods or cutting words. After every back-breaking day spent laboring in fields under the sweltering sun or repairing cracked beams in a villager's creaky old barn, Edward would return home with his shirt damp, his body aching, but his spirit still intact. Before he allowed himself rest, he always walked over to the corner shelf where a battered copper box sat quietly gathering dust. Inside it, Edward dropped a coin or two, sometimes more if he had been fortunate enough to receive a small bonus or an extra loaf of bread as payment. He would lift the lid with care, the hinges squeaking in protest, and gaze at the modest pile growing inside. These coins were not for luxury. They were not for fixing the holes in his boots or replacing his worn-out work gloves. Nor were they for seeking comfort from a physician, even though Maria had asked him more than once, with gentle concern, whether he should consider a trip to the city to see a doctor. Perhaps, she would say, someone could offer a remedy, an ointment, a procedure, even a glass eye to restore symmetry to his face. But Edward would always shake his head with quiet conviction. His answer never changed. "I'd rather use this money for Richard, his schooling, his future. If he wants to learn in a bigger city or a grander school, he'll have the chance," he would say, his voice tinged with both pride and a quiet ache. Maria admired him for this, deeply. She saw how much he sacrificed and how he never once complained. Yet it pained her to see how little Richard understood, How oblivious he was to his father's acts of love carved out in calluses and sweat. Maria sometimes longed to shout the truth into Richard's ears, to make him see the man behind the scar. But Edward, ever patient, would only smile and say, "One day he'll know." But Edward would shake his head, a gentle smile on his lips. "I'd rather use this money for Richard, his schooling, his future. If he wants to learn in a bigger city or a grander school, he'll have the chance." Maria admired him deeply for this unwavering selflessness. Time and again, she had gently pleaded with him to consider his own well-being, to at least consult a traveling physician or perhaps write to the hospital in the nearest city. They could arrange for an examination, she'd argue. There might be a way to restore some symmetry to his face, or at the very least, ease the discomfort he surely felt. But Edward stood firm, his quiet smile resolute. He would place a comforting hand on hers, weathered fingers roughened by years of labor but always warm, and say softly, "If we only have enough for one dream, let it be his." To Maria, those words were like both balm and blade. They soothed her admiration for her husband while simultaneously wounding her with sorrow, knowing he was denying himself not out of obligation, but out of love. She sometimes watched him in the evenings when he thought no one was looking, his good eye staring into the fire, the flickering light dancing over his face, casting shadows in the hollow where his other eye once lived. In those rare, quiet moments, Maria could see the longing in him. Not for vanity or pity, but simply to be able to look his son fully in the face, to see with two eyes the man that Richard might one day become. Yet he never faltered. For Edward, the choice between his own healing and his son's future was no choice at all. It was a father's instinct, sharpened by years of sacrifice and sealed with unconditional love. The tragedy was that Richard knew none of this, none of the late-night toil, none of the aching limbs that still moved with purpose, none of the coins tucked away with quiet hope. To him, his father's missing eye wasn't a mark of sacrifice or endurance. It was a blemish, an embarrassment he could not bear. He never paused to wonder why Edward returned home long after sunset, or why he clutched that dented copper box with such reverence. To Richard, it was just another object collecting dust on a shelf, no different than the old tools and books that cluttered their cottage. He never knew the ritual behind it, the way Edward would count each coin under the glow of a flickering lantern, whispering a prayer not for himself, but for Richard's future. He never saw his father's shoulders sag just slightly in those moments, not from exhaustion alone, but from the weight of hopes deferred. Every coin was a symbol of a lesson postponed, a doctor not seen, a meal made simpler so that Richard might one day sit in a classroom instead of a workshop. To Richard, the box was ordinary. But to Edward, it was sacred, a vessel of love, silently filled each day with the belief that his son might have a life untouched by shame, untouched by pity, untouched by poverty. And so, while Richard turned his eyes away from the one that was missing, he failed to see the one that watched him with unwavering devotion. When Richard turned 10, a new chapter of life opened to him, one that would unknowingly widen the emotional distance between himself and his father. He began attending a proper school situated on the far side of the village, a journey that took him past grazing fields, a slow-moving brook, and weathered stone fences that bore witness to centuries of passing footsteps. The school itself, housed in an old stone building with ivy clinging to its sides, represented everything Edward had hoped for, an opportunity for his son to rise above the limits of their simple life. Richard was quick to adapt to his new environment. He took to learning eagerly, absorbing Latin script with a natural curiosity, and finding joy in deciphering complex arithmetic problems. The teacher, a gray-bearded man named Master Aldrich, recognized the spark in the boy and often praised his diligence, calling him a scholar in the making. Such affirmations bolstered Richard's confidence and subtly shifted his self-image. He began to imagine a future far removed from thatched roofs and dirt paths, a future paved in parchment and polished shoes. He sometimes walked to school with a small group of classmates, boys from slightly better-off families whose fathers owned land or traded goods. They would share lunches of crusty bread, dried apples, and bits of cured meat. They would talk of things Richard had never experienced, journeys to market towns, uncles who had traveled abroad, cousins who sent letters from the city. Richard listened more than he spoke, but inwardly he yearned to be part of their world, to step into conversations without feeling the weight of difference. These walks became moments of silent conflict for Richard. Though he felt pride in being one of the more capable students in class, he carried a quiet dread whenever the subject turned to parents. When the boys boasted of their fathers' trades, voices laced with admiration, Richard stayed quiet. He never dared mention Edward's name, not because he was ashamed of his father's work ethic or values, but because he feared the inevitable question. What happened to his eye? Even at that age, Richard understood the power of image. In a society that valued order, symmetry, and surface propriety, his father's face was an anomaly, a question mark that made people uncomfortable. And so Richard, young and increasingly image-conscious, began to construct a version of himself that omitted Edward. Not with cruelty, not yet, but with omission, with silence, with the smallest steps toward denial. On one occasion, Richard forgot his lunch. Realizing this, Maria quickly packed a slice of dark rye bread and cheese in a small cloth bundle. But she was busy caring for the hearth, so Edward volunteered to take it to the school. The moment Richard saw Edward at the schoolhouse entrance, that pang of humiliation struck. He rushed over and hissed at Edward not to embarrass him in front of everyone. Edward offered the lunch with a timid apology. "I'm sorry if I alarmed your friends. I only wanted to make sure you wouldn't go hungry. I'd rather starve than have you here," Richard blurted, snatching the bundle. Edward quietly turned and left. Though stung by the harsh remark, he dismissed his own feelings. He convinced himself that children could be thoughtless, that perhaps Richard would be grateful one day. Richard's academic potential soon proved unmistakable. He showed a keen ability for problem-solving and grasped new concepts with ease. Seeing this, Maria and Edward decided that Richard should continue beyond the village school and attend a small academy in the nearest town. It took nearly all of Edward's meager savings to make this possible. He accepted additional odd jobs, mending fences, repairing barn doors, even painting local inns. By the time he finally assembled enough coins, he was visibly more tired and thinner, though still wearing a steady grin whenever he spoke of Richard's future. "He'll study. Maybe become a physician or a scholar," Edward would tell Maria at night. "We might even find that special doctor he's always asked about. The one who can cure my missing eye, or at least help me." Maria watched the quiet sorrow he carried. Edward sensed that his one eye was part of the reason Richard avoided him in public. Yet his faith never wavered that Richard would grow to understand, perhaps once he was older and wiser. Around his 15th year, Richard moved to the nearby town, lodging with 3 other boys in a modest dormitory. The buildings there were taller, and the cobblestone streets bustled with people hurrying about their trades: bakers, blacksmiths, wine merchants, and cloth weavers. At first, Richard made a modest effort to stay in touch. He wrote home once or twice in the first month, carefully folded letters detailing the cobbled streets, the vibrant market stalls, the thick scent of roasted chestnuts in the air, and the newness of living in a place where nobody knew his story. In those notes, he assured Maria that he was settling in well, and even expressed some tentative curiosity about how Edward was doing. But as the weeks turned to months, those letters dwindled. The ink dried up. Not because he was overwhelmed or because something terrible had happened, but because he was enthralled. Enthralled by freedom. By reinvention. By the opportunity to craft a version of himself unburdened by village gossip or a father with a conspicuous face. In this new town, no one flinched when they heard his surname. No one squinted at him curiously and asked what had happened to his father's eye. His new friends were bright, witty, and well-dressed. They came from families of influence, sons of merchants, scribes, and traders who had stories about court visits and foreign tutors. They welcomed Richard, praising his intellect and dry humor, and slowly he began to shed his origins like a snake crawling out of its old skin. With every passing week, the image of his father became fuzzier, not entirely forgotten, but increasingly uncomfortable to recall. Richard liked it that way. In the anonymity of this larger social circle, he felt liberated from the shadow of Edward's difference. For the first time, he was not the boy with the strange father. He was simply Richard, clever, articulate, promising. And he guarded that new identity fiercely, even at the cost of silence, even at the cost of forgetting where he came from. Edward and Maria, living off the father's labor and their small garden, eventually decided they, too, might move closer to town. A wealthy merchant needed a caretaker for his old manor stables, offering a tiny cottage on the estate as partial payment. When Edward heard this, he thought, "We'll be nearer to Richard. We can watch out for him. Maybe it's time for our family to be reunited." Unfortunately, Richard saw their arrival not with warmth or gratitude, but as a sudden, unwelcome intrusion into the new life he had carefully crafted. To him, this life, one filled with polished shoes, scholarly debates, and increasingly refined acquaintances, was something fragile and curated, like a delicate painting that might be smudged by the mere suggestion of his rural roots. One Saturday, while the autumn wind rustled amber leaves along the narrow alleyways of the town, Edward, clad in his plain wool coat and carrying a small wicker basket of golden pears picked from the family orchard, arrived at Richard's rented quarters. The building was tall and narrow, its red brick exterior slightly chipped, but still far grander than anything Edward had ever called home. He looked up at the windows with cautious hope before knocking gently on the heavy oak door. The landlady, a matronly woman with spectacles perched on the bridge of her nose, opened the door and eyed him curiously. Edward removed his cap, nodded respectfully, and in a voice as soft as it was hopeful said, "I'm looking for Richard. I'm his father." She nodded, stepping back. "Wait here. I'll call him down." Inside, The warmth of conversation and laughter from upstairs floated down the staircase. Richard, at that very moment, was playing chess with a visiting friend and sipping coffee from a porcelain cup, when the landlady appeared at the foot of the stairs and called up, "Richard, there's a man at the door, says he's your father." His heart stopped cold. He froze mid-move. A chill crawled up his spine. With forced calmness, he excused himself from his guest and descended slowly, each creaking stair an echo of dread. "Richard, there's a man at the door. Says he's your father." Richard froze at the top of the narrow staircase. He braced himself and finally descended, whispering fiercely, "Father, why are you here? You should have told me first. Edward, your mother and I moved nearby. I thought you might like to know we're close if you need anything." Richard refused to invite him in. He feared his friends might see Edward and start asking questions. "Please, father, if you have to come, send me a note first. Just don't suddenly appear. I have my own life now." Edward, holding the basket of pears, forced a smile. "Take these pears, at least." With a weary sigh, Richard accepted but didn't offer a thank you. The final cracks in their relationship showed when Edward invited Richard to live with him and Maria in the small estate cottage. It would save Richard's rent money, and Maria could cook for him. But Richard snapped, "I'd prefer to stay with my friends. It's better for my studies." Edward politely relented. He told Maria not to worry, masking his own quiet sorrow with gentle reassurances. "He's just stressed, overwhelmed with study," he would say, though he could see the truth etched in his son's behavior, the avoidance, the nervous glances, the urgency in his voice when he asked Edward not to visit unannounced. In truth, Richard was terrified, not of his father himself, but of what his father's appearance represented in the carefully constructed image he was trying to uphold. In the elite academic circles he now inhabited, where poise and pedigree were quietly measured behind polished spectacles and restrained smiles, any deviation from perfection was quietly scrutinized. The older Richard grew, the more fiercely he clung to the illusion of control, of refinement, of social elevation. Edward's presence, marked by a visible reminder of sacrifice and imperfection, felt to him like a glaring vulnerability. He began to imagine conversations his peers might have behind his back. He feared the awkward silence when someone asked, "Is that your father?" and the unspoken judgments that would follow. It was not Edward he was ashamed of, but the mirror Edward held up to Richard's own fears of inadequacy, of being marked as different. And so Richard distanced himself, not out of hatred, but out of cowardice. He told himself it was necessary, temporary, even justified. He did not realize that in trying to separate himself from the perceived blemishes of his upbringing, he was cutting himself off from the deepest well of love he would ever know. Eventually, Richard finished his academy studies and secured a decent position in a printing workshop, where he proofread manuscripts and learned the basics of publishing. Flush with newfound success, he moved again, this time closer to the bustling heart of the town. In this period of transformation, he met and married a bright, cheerful woman named Evelyn. Unbeknownst to Edward and Maria, Richard decided not to invite them to the wedding. He wished to avoid questions about his father's eye or his modest upbringing. Soon, a daughter was born to Richard and Evelyn. They named her Lucy. All this occurred without Edward and Maria learning of it. Their only child had begun a family of his own, living in a different quarter of the same town. The tragedy was that Edward remained but a short carriage ride away. Yet Richard never once visited, wrote, or invited him into this new chapter of his life. One day, as Edward was returning from his daily work at the stables, his coat dusted with straw and his boots muddy from the previous night's rain, he passed through the bustling market square at the edge of the estate. There, amidst merchants hawking dried herbs and the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Edward? Is that you?" Turning slowly, Edward squinted into the sunlight and saw a young man, well-dressed, holding a satchel of books, approaching with a look of pleasant surprise. It was Thomas, a former classmate of Richard's, now evidently working in the city. The two exchanged brief pleasantries, with Thomas noting how little Edward had changed, aside from the deepening creases of age. In the course of their short conversation, Thomas mentioned casually, "I see Richard now and then. He lives in the southern quarter of town, near the old stone bridge, with his wife and their little girl. Quite the family man now." The words struck Edward like a bell tolling in an empty chapel. He gave a quiet nod and thanked Thomas, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Richard had a wife, a daughter, a life mere streets away, and yet no letters, no visits, no word for years. That evening, Edward sat long by the fire, staring into the orange embers. The silence between him and his son had grown too vast to ignore. After much contemplation, and encouraged gently by Maria, he decided, enough was enough. If Richard would not come to him, then he would go to Richard. Not to argue or accuse, but to look upon the boy he had raised, to see the face of his granddaughter, to remind his son that family still waited for him, not with bitterness, but with love. With a mixture of anxiety and hope, Edward resolved to make the journey across town the following day, unaware of just how heavy that visit would weigh on both their hearts. He found the address, a handsome row of townhouses lined with flower pots under each window. Edward approached with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. A small child, bright-eyed Lucy, answered the door, only to recoil in shock at Edward's missing eye. "Mama!" Lucy cried. "There's a scary man at the door!" Hearing his daughter's screams, Richard rushed to see what was happening. The moment he recognized Edward, his face tightened with disapproval. "Father, you shouldn't have come here," he said flatly. "My child is terrified. Please leave." Edward tried to explain himself, asking if he could see Lucy, or at least speak to Evelyn. But Richard nearly slammed the door in his face. Hurt and humiliated, Edward turned away, the town's noise swallowing his defeated footsteps. Edward's health, already undermined by decades of grueling labor and the emotional toll of estrangement, began to decline rapidly. He moved more slowly now, his gait stiffened by pain, his breathing shallower with each passing week. Maria noticed how he lingered longer by the fire, how he no longer rose before dawn, and how his appetite dwindled to near nothing. Still, he said nothing of his aches, never once complained, not out of pride, but out of habit. His life had been one long series of sacrifices, and illness, to him, felt like just another quiet burden to bear alone. He continued to show up for his duties at the estate, though others urged him to rest. "You've earned your peace, Edward," one worker said. But Edward only smiled faintly. What would he do with peace? It would not bring his son back. It would not mend what had been broken. Then, one dusky evening, as the last of the light faded from the sky and the wind carried a chill that hinted of early winter, Edward's strength finally failed him. He collapsed quietly in the corner of the estate's storage barn, his frail body crumpling beside stacks of hay and rusted tools. No cry for help, no final words, just the soft thud of a man surrendering to the weight of years. He was discovered the next morning by a young stable hand who had come early to prepare for market day. Startled and shaken, the boy ran to fetch help, but by the time anyone arrived, Edward had already passed, his face pale, his one remaining eye half open, gazing at something beyond the ceiling beams. The tragedy was not only in his passing, but in the silence that surrounded it. Nobody at the estate knew how to contact Richard. Edward had never shared those details, not because he had forgotten, but because he had chosen not to. Perhaps he feared placing another burden on his son. Perhaps he believed, even in his last days, that his love was best expressed through absence, by never forcing Richard to face what he had chosen to leave behind. Maria arranged the burial with a few sympathetic neighbors, tears marking each step of the funeral procession. A kind priest offered final prayers. The chapel bell tolled, echoing through the valley as Edward was laid to rest beneath a simple wooden marker. Some weeks later, Richard finally heard rumors that his father had passed away. Consumed by shock and a pang of guilt, he ran to the old cottage, only to find Maria alone, her eyes rimmed with sorrow. "Richard! Mother, where is father?" "Maria. Gone, my son! You never came, and we had no way to tell you." The reality of Edward's death struck Richard like a hammer blow. He sank to his knees, tears brimming. Maria then revealed the secret Edward had insisted on hiding throughout Richard's life. "You think your father was born with only one eye. But it was not so. When you were 3, you had an accident while playing. A stick flew toward your face, severely damaging your eye. You were in danger of going blind. The physician said the only way to preserve your sight was to take an eye from someone else. Your father gave you his." Richard's breath caught in his throat. He pictured the father he had disdained for that hideous emptiness, never suspecting that he himself had once needed precisely that eye. As the truth flooded over him, Richard felt as if the world tilted beneath his feet. He staggered not from motion but from revelation, from the crushing awareness that the very flaw he had hidden from the world was the reason he had sight at all. A searing memory flashed through his mind, the countless times he had looked away from Edward, embarrassed, impatient, even hostile. And yet behind that missing eye was a story of unimaginable love. He had rejected a man who had once stood in a sterile infirmary, listening as a physician explained that his son might never see again. A man who, without hesitation, offered a piece of his own body to ensure that his child would grow up with a full view of the world, even if it meant losing part of his own. A man who bore ridicule, pity, and even his own son's scorn without ever revealing the truth, because his love had no need for recognition. Richard saw it all now, Edward's quiet endurance, his weathered smile, his eyes that had once been two. He had turned his back on that love, for years, blinded not by the absence of an eye, but by his own pride. For the sake of social acceptance and appearances, he had traded in the most sacred bond a child can know. And Edward, noble in silence, had never asked for anything in return. He had loved without conditions, without applause, without even the hope of gratitude. Now, it was too late. The weight of that sacrifice pressed upon Richard's chest like a stone, and he understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, what true cruelty looked like, not violence, not betrayal, but indifference to love when it stands right in front of you, wounded but steadfast. Remorse clung to Richard like a heavy chain. He wept for hours in the cottage, clutching Maria's hand. Evelyn came later with little Lucy, who marveled at her father's tears and asked in confusion, "Why are you crying so much, Papa?" Richard gently explained that he had lost someone very special, a man whom he never fully appreciated in life. There was no chance now for an apology, a belated thank you, or a simple father and son reconciliation. That opportunity was gone forever. With Edward gone, Maria had only Richard left, though in many ways she felt more alone than ever. Her days were quieter, her nights colder, the echoes of her husband's laughter now mere memories carried in the wind. Richard, stricken by guilt that clung to him like a second skin, could not bear the thought of his mother grieving in solitude. He insisted she come live with him and Evelyn, in a home that was warm, full of life, and perhaps capable of healing old wounds. At first, Maria was hesitant. She had always been independent in her own quiet way, and the idea of entering her son's new world, one shaped by different habits, rhythms, and relationships, unsettled her. She feared becoming a burden, a living reminder of a past Richard was only beginning to confront. But Richard wouldn't take no for an answer. His insistence was not just about duty. It was a yearning for redemption, for a second chance to show love where he had once turned away. And so, with a heart both heavy and hopeful, Maria moved in. She brought little with her, just a small trunk of clothes, Edward's old sweater, and a pressed flower her husband had given her decades ago, now cradled between the pages of a worn prayer book. Perhaps, by caring for his mother now, Richard believed he could rewrite a fragment of the past, not to erase the pain, but to make peace with it. In each cup of tea he poured for her, each moment he paused to listen, each warm gesture that once would have gone unsaid, he was slowly, gently atoning for the regret that would always shadow him. In time, Richard sat Lucy down one rainy afternoon, the kind where the world seemed to slow and the patter of droplets invited reflection. They sat by the window, steam curling from their mugs of chamomile tea, and he began to recount the story of her grandfather, not with bitterness or regret, but with a reverence that trembled through his voice. He told her about a man who once lived humbly, who worked with his hands and carried the weight of 1,000 quiet sacrifices. He explained that the scary face she once glimpsed, just once, long ago, was not something to be feared, but to be revered. That missing eye had not been the result of a curse or a flaw, but of a father's boundless love. Her grandfather had given up part of himself so that his child could see the world with both eyes, choosing permanent darkness in one eye so his son wouldn't live in total shadow. Lucy, eyes wide and heart softening, listened intently. As she grew older, the story became a treasured part of her identity. She kept a small photograph of Edward in her diary and spoke of him with pride to her school friends. It hurt her that she had never truly known him, that her one memory had been marked by fear rather than warmth. But in the years that followed, that fear was replaced by admiration and a quiet mourning for the bond that had never fully blossomed. Through her father's stories, she came to understand not only who Edward had been, but who her father was becoming, a man transformed by truth, humbled by loss, and forever shaped by the legacy of a one-eyed hero. Though the wound in Richard's heart never fully healed, he tried to live in a way that honored Edward's memory, extending kindness to others, standing up for those who looked different, and placing genuine love above public opinion. The moral, though painfully obvious, bears repeating, and perhaps a moment of silent reflection. We must never judge a parent, or anyone, solely by their outward appearance. What we perceive as imperfections or disfigurements may in fact be physical testaments to a love that endures quietly and gives selflessly. The very flaws that make us uncomfortable can often be the markers of past bravery, of moments where someone chose pain so another could live easier. Edward's missing eye was not a symbol of weakness, nor even simply of loss. It was a mark of immeasurable devotion, the kind that speaks not in grand declarations, but in a life lived entirely for someone else. Yet Richard, blinded by shame and societal pressure, failed to recognize that truth until it was too late. What does this teach us in a broader European context? Across the cobblestone streets and timber-framed homes of Europe's historic towns and villages, societal expectations have long been woven tightly into daily life. These communities, often defined by tradition, reputation, and family name, thrive on closeness, but also on scrutiny. Loyalty is cherished, but so too is maintaining appearances, often at the cost of vulnerability. In such environments, a single perceived flaw can carry far beyond the household, magnified through murmurs at the baker's shop or glances exchanged at the parish gates. In Richard's case, the pressure to conform, to protect himself from being seen as different or lesser, eclipsed the more fundamental human truth, that love, sacrifice, and authenticity matter more than polished facades. The shame he felt was not born of his father's actions, but from his own fear of how others might judge what they didn't understand. His downfall wasn't cruelty. It was complicity in a culture that prized image over essence. And in yielding to that, he forfeited precious years of connection with the one person who had given everything for him. Richard's story reflects a quiet but profound critique of the ways in which community expectations can stifle empathy. It is a reminder that in our quest to be accepted, we must not lose sight of those who accept us unconditionally, even if they don't look like everyone else. Regret, once it arrives, is a merciless teacher. It strips away illusions and leaves us face to face with the truth we long avoided. Yet, it carries with it the strange power to illuminate, to teach, and to transform. In Richard's case, regret shattered the comfortable silence he had lived in for years and forced him to confront the depth of love he had once disregarded. His story may serve as a mirror for any of us who have turned away from someone who once loved us unconditionally, be it a parent, a sibling, or a friend. We often wait for milestones, weddings, illnesses, or funerals, to reevaluate our relationships. But what if we chose presence over procrastination? What if we chose humility over pride? We don't need to wait for death's finality to say what our hearts have carried all along. There is immense power in a single letter, a phone call, a shared cup of tea, simple acts that could reopen doors long shut. Richard's journey is not just about loss. It is about the invitation we all carry to make amends, to see others anew, and to extend love while it can still be felt and returned. Richard's redemption began only after the greatest loss. a realization that arrived not with celebration, but with silence and sorrow. It was only in the absence of his father's presence that he finally understood the depth of his father's love. That revelation, though painful, gave rise to a transformation, one that would ripple through the rest of his life. His story stands as a quiet plea to all of us, to recognize the good in those we love before the opportunity fades into memory. To look beyond flaws, to listen before judging, and to lean into grace rather than guilt. A single eye, once dismissed with shame, became the symbol of a love too deep to measure. And a single moment, offered with empathy, can change a legacy, heal a heart, and prevent a lifetime of regret. If this story touched your heart or gave you a moment of quiet reflection, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to Epic English Stories. Your support helps us continue crafting thoughtful tales that not only enrich your emotional world but also expand your English vocabulary in a meaningful, story-driven way. Every share helps someone else connect with these powerful life lessons, and every subscription brings you one step closer to mastering English through immersive storytelling. Let's grow together, one heartfelt story, one new word at a time.